And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Okay, tonight's weather, watching this next storm bringing already 50 to 60 mile per hour wind gusts here to the central and eastern Aleutian areas. Those winds will be advancing up the Alaska Peninsula with increasing snow and blowing snow as the night wears on. A lot calmer conditions to the north and light winds over all of interior Alaska. This low continues to weaken, so those gusty north winds here through Resurrection Bay and the Seward area will continue to diminish. And looks like this low tracking east of the Panhandle may clip the southern southeast coast with rain and snow there, but amounts will be lighter, more showery up here along the North Gulf Coast, Juneau area, back out toward Cordova. And for excuse me, for tomorrow, low pressure here with the front pushing northeastward, the low kind of hanging back farther to the south. And there's a blizzard warning out for Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula, winter weather advisory out for the eastern Aleutians, snow and blowing snow all through this area, wind and precipitation on the increase, southern Kenai Peninsula, southern Cook Inlet, and eventually the North Gulf Coast here, but that'll be a little later on. Stays showery over the Panhandle. And then looking at Saturday, that low maintains its strength, 958 millibars, right up to just east of Kodiak Island. So storm force winds in these areas here, all the way back into the Gulf of Alaska, North Gulf Coast, Panhandle, mostly storm force winds with good gales over the inside waters. And there's a high wind watch out for much of the southeast coast for winds gusting as high as 60 to 65 miles per hour. Widespread area of snow here over the western interior. Conditions starting to improve slowly with the winds coming down for Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula area. And for the coastal water forecast for tomorrow, Friday, winds out of the west on the south coast at 20 knots, 15 knots for the central coast, and the north coast variable 10 to 15 knots. Light southeast breeze for Lincoln out 10 knots, and south at 10 for Stevens Passage. Clarence Strait, northwest wind, 15 knots. And then for Saturday, storm force winds out of the east and southeast here at 50 knots with higher gusts for the central and south coast. Gale warnings for the North Gulf Coast with winds 35 to 50 knots out of the east. And those seas coming up pretty good, 25 to 30 feet here along the entire coastline. Full gales for Clarence Strait, southeast 35 knots, seas 17 feet, southeast 30, gust 45 knots, Stevens Passage and Lynn Canal. Small craft advisory for south winds at 25 knots. Prince William Sound for Friday, east winds at 15 knots in the eastern North Gulf Coast, southeast at 20, west winds 20 knots there for the western North Gulf Coast. Variable 30-knot winds, you don't see that too often. For the Barren Islands, northeast gales for Kamishak Bay and Cook Inlet, northeast 20 to 30 knots with seas up to 8 feet here south of the Forelands. And then even stronger winds in the forecast for Saturday, northern Cook Inlet, northeast winds 30 knots, seas possibly up to 9 feet, north winds 40 knots here south of the Forelands with 11-foot seas, gale warnings, Kamishak Bay, northeast at 35, east 25 for the Barren Islands. And for the eastern North Gulf Coast, storm warnings, east winds 50 to 55 knots with seas 22 feet. And Prince William Sound, good gales, southeast 40 knots, seas 10 feet. And for Kodiak Island, east to southeast gales tomorrow, 35 to 40 knots, northeast 30 for Bristol Bay. And for the Alaska Peninsula, north to northeast winds 35 to 45 knots. And then for Saturday, Alaska Peninsula, northwest winds blowing right across the area there at 35 to 40 knots with those 40-knot winds all the way up to Sitkinak Island there, south of Kodiak. Kodiak Island itself, east-northeast 20 to 25 knots, strongest in Shelikof Strait, northeast 30 for Bristol Bay. And for the eastern Aleutians, we've got northeast winds, 45 to 50 knots for the day tomorrow at seas as high as 22 feet south of Nikolsky. And gales for the Adak and Atka, northeast 40 knots, and variable 25 for the area west of Adak to Kiska there. Bering Sea side south at 25, the Pacific side here is north at 25. And then westerly gales from Kiska to Shimei at 35 knots. And then we've got much lighter winds in the forecast for Saturday for all of the Aleutians here. West of Adak to Shimei, west 20 to 25 knots. And central Aleutians here, west to 20 knots. 15 knots there for Nikolsky. And Unalaska, northwest winds 30 knots. For the southwest coast, south of Nunivak Island, north winds 30 knots tomorrow. North at 15 for Friday for the Yukon Delta coast. Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, northwest winds 15 knots. And the Pribilofs, northeast at 25 with seas up to 7 feet. Northeast at 20, 6-foot seas for St. Matthew Island. And Saturday, north winds 20 knots out here over the Bering Sea from St. Matthew Island to St. George. And full gales here, or good gales anyway. 40-knot northwest winds for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. Northwest 25, Yukon Delta coastline up to St. Lawrence Island. And a little bit lighter there in Norton Sound at 20 knots. And for the eastern Arctic coast tomorrow, west winds 5 to 10 knots. Light north winds 5 to 10 knots for the central and west coast. Chukchi Sea north becoming west 15 to 25 knots. And taking a look at the Saturday outlook, east winds 15 knots, eastern Beaufort Sea coast. And for the central coast, not too bad, northeast at 10 knots. Picking up to 15 knots out of the northeast on the west side. And generally small craft advisories for the Chukchi Sea for north to northwest winds 20 to 25 knots. Or that's actually a brisk wind advisory due to these ice-covered waters.